Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you're likely someone who appreciates looking past the polished marble statues and the neat, tidy narratives we're all handed in our school books.
Yeah, the ones that just gloss over the reality.
Exactly. So today we are undertaking a very specific mission. We're looking at a rigorous, sobering, and honestly incredibly detailed YouTube video transcript from the channel The Wicked Historian.
Right, and the video is titled Alexander the Great's Ruthless Strategy for Conquered Kingdoms, the Truth They Don't Teach.
And our goal for this conversation isn't just to list famous battles or recite dates or recount brilliant military maneuvers. We're here to look past 23 centuries of spectacular PR to examine the brutal, systematic mechanics of Alexander's conquests.
Which is heavy, but so necessary.
It is. We want to uncover the specific human cost, particularly for the women in those conquered cities, that the title The Great was explicitly designed to hide.
It really is a profound shift in perspective. When we usually approach history, especially ancient military history, we're almost always looking at it from the top down.
Like we're generals ourselves.
Exactly. We're invited by the authors to stand shoulder to shoulder with the conquerors in the command tent, looking at maps, moving pieces around the board. But the source material today asks us to do the exact opposite.
To step out of that tent.
Yes, to step out of the command tent and look at the reality on the ground. Specifically, the reality of the tens of thousands of people who were processed into the machinery of an ancient empire. It requires us to completely deconstruct the mythos surrounding a figure who has been universally celebrated for over 2 millennia.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that very title, Alexander the Great. I was reading through the notes, and it struck me how that name functions in our modern vocabulary.
It's just a given, right?
Yeah, it is actually a conclusion disguised as an introduction. It's a label we use as automatically as Julius Caesar or Genghis Khan. The adjective has been completely absorbed by the name, burying the very necessary question of whether that specific adjective is actually deserved.
Right. We're taught about the brilliant student of Aristotle.
The military genius with the perfect hair who swept across the known world, spreading Greek civilization, creating the Hellenistic age. But honestly, reading this source made me wonder, is the history we've been taught just a lie?
Well, it isn't necessarily that the standard historical narrative is completely false in its facts. I mean, Alexander did conquer those territories. He did win those battles.
So the dates are right.
The dates are right, yeah. The issue, our source points out, is that the narrative is incomplete in a way that functions as a lie of omission. And we really have to understand why it's so incomplete. The historiographical problem here, the history of how the history was written, is paramount.
Who's writing it down?
Exactly. The ancient historians we rely on for the story of Alexander, primarily men like Arrian Plutarch, Diodorus Curtius, they were all men who fundamentally admired him.
Right, but they were writing centuries ago. Didn't they have access to primary sources that we don't?
They did, but look at what those primary sources were. Arrian, for example, based his accounts heavily on the memoirs of Ptolemy.
And Ptolemy was one of his guys.
Right. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's own generals who later became the ruler of Egypt. He had every vested interest in presenting his former commander in the most flattering, heroic light possible, because his own political legitimacy rested on his connection to Alexander's glory.
Makes sense.
And then Plutarch, on the other hand, was explicitly writing studies in moral character. He wasn't writing objective history. He was selecting episodes specifically to illustrate philosophical virtues, minimizing the atrocities by wrapping them in very specific, carefully chosen language.
The language, yes. The source spends a lot of time on this. It seems like the way they wrote about these events is actually one of the most insidious parts of this whole historical cover-up.
What's fascinating here is how a simple grammar trick, the passive voice, has successfully distanced 23 centuries of readers from the horrific reality of tens of thousands of people being processed into slavery.
It's wild how effective it is.
It is. You read these ancient texts, and the historians will write things like, the city was taken, the inhabitants were sold. That passive construction acts as an incredible psychological shield for the reader.
Because it removes the perpetrator entirely from the sentence.
Exactly. A city does not take itself. People do not sell themselves. Alexander's soldiers, following explicit orders, breached those walls with weapons. Alexander's officers organized the logistics of the auctions where human beings were priced, inspected, and sold to the highest bidder.
But by writing, the inhabitants were sold.
The historians allow the reader to glide right past the atrocity without confronting the moral horror and move swiftly onto the next glorious battle scene.
It's brilliant, dark PR. And that brings us to the core of this deep dive.
Yeah.
If you've ever felt like the neat, tidy narratives of history leave out the real story, this discussion is going to completely reframe one of the most famous figures of all time for you.
We're going into the shadow of his empire.
We are going to explore the shadow of Alexander's empire. And to do that, we need to start at the beginning of his reign. We're looking at autumn 335 BC. Alexander is just 21 years old.
Just a kid, really.
A kid. He's a newly crowned king because his father, Philip of Macedon, has just been assassinated. There's a power vacuum.
Yeah.
And the Greek city of Thebes decides to revolt against the Macedonian garrison that Philip had left behind. Why Thebes? Were they just opportunistic?
Opportunistic, yes, but also immensely proud. I mean, Thebes was one of the oldest and most celebrated pillars of the Hellenic world. This was a city with a deep mythological and historical pedigree.
They had a real reputation.
They had a massive history of military dominance. They were the city that had previously broken the power of Sparta. So when they saw an untested 21-year-old boy taking the throne in Macedonia, a kingdom they already viewed as somewhat barbaric compared to the refined culture of southern Greece, they thought they could reclaim their total independence.
It was a massive, fatal miscalculation.
Because they underestimated the kid. Gravely. Alexander didn't hesitate. He moved with a terrifying, almost supernatural speed that would become the hallmark of his military career.
He marched them so fast.
Yeah. He force-marched his army from Macedonia down to Thebes in under 2 weeks. Now, the Thebans, upon seeing this army arrive so quickly, still expected a negotiation. They thought their status as a legendary Greek city, the city that produced the revered poet Pindar, would force Alexander to the table.
They figured they could talk their way out of it.
Right. They assumed there would be terms, hostages exchanged, a diplomatic resolution.
But Alexander wasn't there to negotiate.
No. He initiated a siege that lasted days. And when the walls were finally breached, the outcome wasn't just a standard military defeat where the losing army surrenders and goes home. It was the execution of a deliberate, calculated policy of total erasure.
The source material is incredibly grim here. Alexander ordered the entire city of Thebes razed to the ground. Every home, every civic building dismantled or burned.
He spared almost nothing.
He spared only 2 things: the temples of the gods and the house of Pindar the poet, supposedly because he wanted to show the rest of Greece that he respected culture.
Yeah, but as the video points out, culture was preserved. The people who created it were not. The physical outcome of this siege was staggering. 6,000 Thebans were killed in the streets, and 30,000 people were enslaved.
We really need to pause on that number. 30,000.
It's so large that the human mind naturally resists processing it as individual experiences. And honestly, that's exactly how the ancient historians intended it to function. It becomes a clean clinical statistic on a page.
Just a number.
But those 30,000 were individuals. They were women, children, the elderly, and the wounded, who were herded into makeshift holding areas in the mud outside the burning walls of their home. It represents 30,000 individual moments of violent capture, 30,000 forced permanent separations of mothers from children, sisters from brothers.
And yet, if you look at how standard history textbooks handle the fall of Thebes, they rarely focus on those 30,000 people in the mud. Instead, they almost always pivot to one very specific story.
The story of Timoclea.
Right. It's the story of a woman named Timoclea. You'll find this prominent in Plutarch. You'll find it in Diodorus. The story goes that Timoclea is a noble woman of Thebes. Her brother had actually fought and died fighting against Alexander's father years earlier. During the chaos of the city's sack, a Thracian cavalry officer fighting for Alexander breaks into her home and assaults her.
Horrific.
Afterward, he demands to know where she hides her gold and silver.
Right. He expects her to be utterly broken by the assault.
But she isn't. Timoclea, showing incredible composure, tells him she threw all her valuables down the deep well in her courtyard to keep them safe. When the officer eagerly leans over the edge of the well to peer into the darkness, she pushes him in and then hurls heavy stones down onto him until he's crushed to death.
It's an incredibly dramatic, cinematic moment of defiance. And of course, she's immediately discovered, arrested by other soldiers, and brought before Alexander himself in chains. She's covered in dirt and blood, facing the king who ordered the destruction of her city.
And what does she do?
When Alexander asks who she is, she answers him without apology, without the cowering fear he might expect. She looks him in the eye and proudly states her lineage, declaring she's the sister of the man who fought his father.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Alexander doesn't execute her for killing his officer. He admires her. He loves this kind of aristocratic defiance, this aesthetic display of fearlessness.
So he pardons her?
He pardons her on the spot.
Ah.
He orders his guards to let her and her children walk free. Now, for centuries, this exact story has been taught in classrooms as definitive proof of Alexander's magnanimity, his noble character, and his unique ability to recognize greatness, even in a defeated enemy. It makes him look like a just and reasonable king.
But our source brilliantly analyzes how this true story functions historically as a curtain. It flatters Alexander, yes. It makes for a compelling narrative. But think deeply about what that narrative hides.
Behind the curtain.
Exactly. Behind that dramatic, cinematic scene of the king pardoning the noblewoman stand the 30,000 women and children who did not have courtyard wells to trick soldiers into. The women who did not possess noble lineage to impress a king.
The ones who didn't get a personal audience.
The women who never got a personal audience with Alexander to plead their case or demonstrate their bravery. By focusing all of our historical attention on the one exceptional woman who was spared the ancient writers, give the reader psychological permission to completely ignore the 30,000 who were systematically destroyed that exact same afternoon.
So it's a deliberate misdirection.
Absolutely. It perfectly illustrates how exceptional anecdotes are weaponized in historical texts to mask systemic cruelty. We focus on the one to forget the many. We feel good about Timoclea's survival, which alleviates the moral burden of grappling with the enslavement of her entire civilization.
And those, many, faced a terrifying reality. This brings us to the mechanics of that enslavement, which is something the passive voice so effectively hides. We need to talk about the contract.
Right, the 13-year contract.
The source details how Alexander essentially offered every city he encountered over his 13 years of conquest a very stark binary contract. Surrender immediately and receive mercy, or resist and face total destruction.
In cold military terms, it was a highly rational policy. It was designed to terrify cities into submission, which would save his army from having to fight endless resource-draining sieges across Asia.
But the source points out a devastating asymmetry in this contract that is rarely discussed. Think about who's actually making the choice.
The men.
The decision to fight or to open the gates was made entirely by men. The generals, the kings, the male-only city councils, the wealthy aristocrats, they were the ones who sat in closed rooms, debated the strategy, and made the military calculations.
So women had no say.
The women of these cities had absolutely zero voice in those deliberations. They didn't vote, they didn't sit on the councils, yet they bore an entirely different and in many ways much longer-lasting consequence if that military calculation failed.
That is such a crucial point. If the men on the council chose to resist and the city fell, those men faced death in battle or execution shortly after. In the brutal logic of the ancient world, that was the accepted, understood risk of being a male combatant or a politician.
But for the women,
the consequence of losing wasn't a sudden death on the walls defending their home. It was capture, sorting, and sale. It was a lifetime of forced servitude in a strange land under an owner whose authority over their bodies and their labor was absolute. The men of the city wagered the lives and futures of the women without the women ever having a single say in the bet.
And let's look at the chilling mechanics behind that phrase, the inhabitants were sold. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Once the fighting stopped and the city was secured, the soldiers underwent a psychological and functional transition. They went from being combatants to being laborers. Their job was no longer killing the enemy, it was processing the spoils of war.
Human spoils.
And in this context, human beings were categorized exactly the same as captured gold, horses, or grain. The source describes these massive holding areas constructed outside the city where the captive population was mechanically sorted based on the demands of the international slave markets.
It wasn't just a chaotic mob being marched away, it was organized.
Highly organized. Families were broken apart with total bureaucratic indifference. Young, healthy women were separated from the elderly because they appealed to different buyers.
Unbelievable.
Children were pulled from their mother's arms if a buyer preferred them sold individually, or if the mother was being sold to a buyer who didn't want the burden of feeding a child. It was a literal industrial process of dismantling a society person by person.
The source brings up Diodorus here, and is bone-chilling. Diodorus the historian writes about the aftermath of Thebes, but he does it with the detached clinical tone of an economist.
He talks about the market prices.
Right. He observes that flooding the slave markets of the Greek world with 30,000 bodies all at once completely depressed the prices. The regional market simply could not absorb that much human supply at full value. So the women of Thebes became financially worth less simply because there were too many of them.
They were subjected to the exact same macroeconomic laws of supply and demand as a bumper crop of wheat or a massive shipment of olive oil.
That economic reduction of human life is staggering. It highlights how entirely their humanity, their individuality had been stripped away by the conquerors. They were no longer people, they were inventory.
And the sheer terror of this impending reality was not lost on the people of Thebes while the walls were falling. The source mentions a horrifying alternative that some families chose in the final hours of the city.
I know what you're going to say, and it's just so dark.
Rather than be captured, sorted, and fed into this economic meat grinder, some families locked their doors, barred their windows, and intentionally set their own homes on fire, choosing to burn alive together as a family.
I had to stop and reread that part of the note several times. Burning your own children alive. History, in its usual romanticized way, often frames those acts as Theban courage or Theban pride, like they wouldn't bow to the conqueror.
But the source reveals it for what it truly was, a desperate, crystal-clear understanding of exactly what awaited them on the auction block. When burning your own family alive is considered the preferable option, it tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the horror of the alternative.
It strips away any illusion of ancient warfare being a noble pursuit. Thebes established the template for Alexander's campaigns. It was a bloody precedent for everything that followed. He proved that he would enforce the ultimate penalty for resistance.
And this grim machinery of conquest, sorting, and selling moved with Alexander's army as it marched out of Europe and across the continent into Asia. 3 years later, in 332 BC, we see the consequences of this policy escalate dramatically on the Levantine coast at the Siege of Tyre.
Let's set the stage for Tyre, because geographically it is a fascinating and terrifying scenario. Tyre was a Phoenician city, but it wasn't just on the coast. It was an island fortress, located about half a mile offshore into the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of modern Lebanon.
It was heavily fortified.
Massively fortified with stone walls that plunged straight down into deep water. They had an incredibly powerful navy, and crucially, they were completely confident in their defenses. They had historical precedent on their side. They had successfully resisted a massive siege by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar that lasted for 13 years.
So they weren't easily intimidated.
Not at all. So when Alexander's army approached the coast and demanded entry into the city to make a sacrifice at their temple, the Tyrians flatly denied him. They closed the gates and told him to stay on the mainland.
Which, given Alexander's ego and his strategic need to secure the coast before marching inland, was an unacceptable answer. He could not leave a hostile, powerful naval base operating behind him. But he had no fleet to speak of at that moment.
So what does he do?
Facing an impregnable island fortress, Alexander ordered his army to do the seemingly impossible. He ordered them to build a causeway, a land bridge made of stone, rubble timber, and earth straight across the half-mile of deep ocean to connect the mainland to the island.
The engineering of this is mind-boggling. For 7 grueling months, his soldiers labored yard by yard, dumping material into the sea. And they weren't just building in peace.
No, they were under constant attack.
As they got closer to the island, they came under constant relentless attack from Tyrian ships. The defenders were firing catapults, raining down arrows, and sending in fire ships to burn the construction equipment. The Macedonians were building siege towers on the end of the causeway just to protect the workers.
It was a brutal, muddy, blood-soaked project that built up an immense toxic reservoir of frustration and rage within the Macedonian army. You have an army that is used to moving fast, winning decisive cavalry battles, now bogged down for over half a year, watching their friends die, constructing a bridge under a hail of fire.
The psychological toll was immense.
And when that causeway was finally completed in July of 332 BC, and the Macedonian siege engines finally breached the walls of Tyre, the fall of the city was catastrophic. The Macedonians poured in and fought with a ferocity born of those 7 months of setbacks and casualties. 8,000 Tyrians were slaughtered in the immediate savage street and rooftop fighting.
But it's what happened after the city was secured, right?
Yeah, after the battle was one that truly reveals the cold, calculated nature of Alexander's brutality. The source details that 2,000 military-aged men who had survived the initial slaughter were marched out of the city and crucified in long rows all along the beach of the mainland.
2,000 crosses on a beach. So what does this all mean strategically? If Alexander is so focused on the economics of slavery, why kill 2,000 healthy men who could be sold for a profit?
That's the million-dollar question.
The source points out that those crucifixions weren't just about punishment or venting the army's rage. They were a billboard. They were a massive, grotesque advertisement. Think about where Tyre is located. It's a major hub. Every single merchant ship that sailed past the coast of the Levant, every captain trading in the Eastern Mediterranean saw those bodies rotting on the shoreline.
They carried that horrifying visual message back to their own ports across the world. This is the cost of delaying Alexander.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are exactly right. Those 2,000 men had their commercial value as laborers deliberately sacrificed for their message value. Alexander spent that human capital to buy fear.
But the women of Tyre, the 30,000 women and children who were captured alive, they were treated entirely differently. They had pure market value, and they were not crucified because their worth lay entirely in their commodification.
And these weren't just unskilled laborers.
Not at all. The Phoenician women of Tyre were highly prized in the ancient Mediterranean world. Their culture was advanced and wealthy, which meant these women were equipped with highly specialized, lucrative skills.
The notes detail this specifically. They were trained in complex domestic management for large estates. They were experts in advanced textile work. And crucially, Tyre was the center of production for Tyrian purple dye.
The color of royalty.
Exactly. This was the most expensive, sought-after luxury commodity in the ancient world, extracted drop by drop from sea snails. The women who knew how to process the textiles for this dye were incredibly valuable assets.
It creates a truly sickening paradox. The very cultural refinement and specialized skills that made a Tyrian woman respected, wealthy, and valuable in her free life were the exact same attributes that determined her higher price tag as a captive tool.
The slave market didn't care about her dignity.
The slave market did not care that she had learned these skills in a position of freedom. It only cared about her output function. We are asked by the source to picture these horrific, intimate auctions likely taking place right out in the open near the ruins of the city. Buyers circling raised wooden platforms, prying open the mouths of terrified women to inspect their teeth for health and age, running hands over their palms to check for the calluses that would prove they were accustomed to hard, useful labor.
Her name, her family history, her entire past was erased in that single moment on the platform. She was given a new name by whoever bought her. She was reduced from a human being to a ledger entry, her worth measured entirely in drachmas.
And again, the ancient historians shield us from this. They write those 5 passive words. The inhabitants were sold.
Which functioned as a heavy door they refused to open, shielding us from the agonizing reality of a woman losing her children, her home, her status, and her very identity in the space of a single sun-drenched afternoon.
This pattern of ruthless, overwhelming consequence for resistance is awful enough. It's a dark reality of ancient war. But the source material takes us to an even darker place. It demands we look at what happened when a city actually followed Alexander's rule.
When they surrendered.
What happened when they looked at the contract chose surrender and Alexander broke his own word. Let's move the timeline forward 2 years to 330 BC, the fall of Persepolis.
Persepolis. Just the name conjures up images of immense wealth. It was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, located deep in modern-day Iran. It was widely considered the richest city in the known world, acting as the central vault for 2 centuries of imperial tribute gathered from across Asia.
And Alexander wanted it.
At this point in the timeline, Alexander has won massive battles and is relentlessly pursuing the fleeing Persian king Darius III across Mesopotamia. And when Alexander's forces finally arrive at the outskirts of Persepolis, the city's leadership makes a crucial decision. They do not resist.
They surrender.
The garrison surrenders without a fight. The massive gates are open to the Macedonians.
By the explicit terms of Alexander's own 13-year contract, surrender equaled mercy. That was the deal. They capitulated so the city and its people should have been spared from violence. But they weren't. Alexander unleashes his army on the civilian population anyway. Why? The source material analyzes the motivations here, describing the sack as a form of brutal compensation. The Macedonian army had marched over 1,300 miles from their homes. They had endured unimaginable hardships, fought massive battles, and they had been promised by their king that they would eventually take the richest city on earth. Alexander realized he could not deny his men their ultimate prize, regardless of the city's peaceful compliance.
He let the wolves off the leash. The scale of the looting described in the text is almost impossible to visualize. The ancient records say it took 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to carry away the gold, silver, and jewels from the royal treasury alone.
Which is just an unfathomable amount of wealth.
Right. But while the royal treasury was being systematically emptied by the king's quartermasters, The ordinary soldiers were spreading out, moving violently through the sprawling residential quarters of the city. They were kicking in doors, stripping private homes of anything valuable, jewelry, fine textiles, art. And the women inside those homes were treated as nothing more than additional valuables to be seized alongside the physical treasure.
The violence against the women of Persepolis during the sack was so severe, so chaotic, that even Diodorus, who usually hides behind that clinical passive voice, drops the grammar trick. He actively describes soldiers dragging women by their hair from their homes, fighting each other over who gets to claim the most beautiful captive.
It's just complete anarchy.
But the ultimate lasting destruction of Persepolis didn't end with the looting and the enslavement. It ended in fire. And the context of how that fire started is vital. Alexander and his inner circle of generals were having a massive wine-soaked banquet in the royal palace, a magnificent structure known as the Apadana, famous for its towering columns and cedar roofs.
And then Thais gets up.
During this feast, as the drinking reaches a fever pitch, a woman named Thais stands up to address the king and his commanders.
Thais is a fascinating historical figure. She was an Athenian courtesan and the companion of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's top generals. She stands up in the middle of this raucous party and suggests that they should burn the grand palace of Persepolis to the ground.
She pitches it as an act of poetic, historical revenge.
Exactly. 150 years earlier, the Persian king Xerxes had invaded Greece and burned the temples of Athens. Thais argued that the conquerors of Persia, now sitting victoriously in the Persian king's own grandest hall, should repay that historical debt in kind.
And the drunken generals just erupt in cheers at the idea. Alexander himself swept up in the frenzy, and the alcohol grabs a torch and throws it first. Thais throws one right after him.
And the palace, with its dry cedar beams, its gold leaf ceilings, and its incredible carved staircases, goes up in flames almost instantly. The fire is uncontrollable, it spreads beyond the banquet hall, and soon the entire ceremonial city is burning.
Now, Plutarch records that Alexander, supposedly sobered up, realized the magnitude of what he had done, regretted the action almost immediately, and ordered the fire extinguished.
Too little, too late.
Way too late. The destruction was absolute. The ash was already falling on the ruins of the greatest city in Asia.
Now, historians have debated this specific event for centuries, haven't they? They usually frame it as a character study of Alexander's impulsiveness, his complex nature, his struggle with alcohol, or his immediate noble regret. Or they focus entirely on Thais, framing it as a story about the incredible dangerous influence she wielded over the most powerful men in the world in that moment.
But our source pushes back against all of that. The video demands that we shift our perspective entirely away from the banquet hall. We need to look away from the conqueror holding the torch and instead look out into the darkness toward the holding areas outside the city walls.
We absolutely must. We have to imagine the captive women, the human spoils who had just been dragged from their homes hours earlier, standing in the cold, watching their magnificent city burn to the ground from a distance. The source presents a deeply philosophical and heartbreaking point here. For those enslaved women, the fire did something the slave market alone could not do. It destroyed the future tense.
The future tense. I keep thinking about that phrase. Explain what the source means by that.
Well, even in the absolute depths of slavery, a captive might psychologically hold on to a microscopic, purely theoretical hope. The hope that someday, somehow, through some miracle or turn of fortune, she might escape. She might find her way back across the mountains and return home to the streets she knew.
Or a tiny spark of hope.
But watching Persepolis burn to ash, watching the sky glow orange with the destruction of everything she had ever known, erased that possibility entirely. The physical place they belonged to simply ceased to exist. The fire didn't just consume buildings, it consumed their past, and it consumed any hypothetical future they might have dreamed of to keep themselves sane in captivity.
It's a profound existential trauma that the ancient historians literally didn't have the capacity or more likely the desire to record. They were too busy chronicling the inner turmoil of the man who started the fire to care about the people whose lives were turned to ash.
They just didn't care.
And I think to really understand Alexander's capacity for this kind of ruthless detachment, we can't just look at how he treated his defeated enemies or the civilians of foreign cities. The source argues that we have to examine how he treated the people who loved him. We need to look at the men in his own inner circle.
Because if you want to truly understand the psychology of a man who can order the enslavement of tens of thousands without hesitation, you look at his closest relationships. How does he handle dissent? How does he handle those who challenge him?
The story of Clytus the Black is the perfect starting point for this analysis. Clytus wasn't just another soldier in the phalanx, he was a senior officer, and more importantly, he was the man who literally saved Alexander's life.
All right, we have to go back to the Battle of the Granicus in 334 BC to understand this. This was early in the campaign. Alexander was just 22 years old, full of reckless bravery. During the battle, he charges headlong into the enemy cavalry, gets completely surrounded, and is fighting for his life.
Very close call.
A Persian officer raises his battle axe and is a fraction of a second away from bringing it down on Alexander's skull. Clytus, riding nearby, swings his own sword, severs the Persian officer's arm at the shoulder, and saves the young king's life. Without Clytus acting in that exact second, the legend of Alexander the Great ends right there in the dirt of Asia Minor. There's no empire.
He owed Clytus everything. But fast forward several years later to a banquet in Samarkand, deep in Central Asia. The army has been marching, fighting, and bleeding for years. And during this time, Alexander has started changing. He is adopting Persian autocratic customs, wearing Persian royal robes, and most controversially demanding that his own fiercely independent Macedonian officers begin to bow and worship him as a divine figure.
Which didn't go over well.
Not at all. At this banquet, Clytus, fueled by heavy drinking and the bold, perhaps misplaced confidence of a man who knows he saved the king's life, criticizes Alexander openly. He tells him he is abandoning his Macedonian roots, that he is disrespecting the veteran soldiers who actually built his empire, and he mocks Alexander's claim to be the son of a god.
In Alexander's response to the man who saved him, he flies into a blind rage, grabs a spear from one of his guards, and murders Clytus right there on the banquet hall floor. He drives a spear through the chest of the man who gave him the opportunity to conquer the world.
Brutal.
Now, the histories always make sure to mention that Alexander wept bitterly for 3 days afterward. He refused food. He lay in his tent calling out Clytus's name, claiming he wanted to die. But as the source points out, the grief doesn't unthrow the spear. And the message sent to the rest of the army was terrifyingly clear. Disagree with me, challenge my authority or my divinity, and you die, even if you save my life.
It marked a turning point. It was the beginning of a systematic purge of anyone in the high command who threatened his absolute authority or his rapidly evolving God complex. The paranoia became institutionalized.
Like what happened to Philotas.
Take the case of Philotas, one of his most prominent and capable cavalry commanders. Philotas was accused of knowing about a vague plot against Alexander's life and failing to report it immediately. The evidence against him was incredibly thin, mostly based on hearsay and rivalries within the camp. But Alexander had him arrested, tortured relentlessly until he produced a confession and then executed him in front of the army.
But the paranoia of an autocrat rarely stops with the immediate suspect. Philotas was the son of Parmenion. And Parmenion wasn't just anybody, he was a legendary 70-year-old general.
A pillar of the army.
This was a man who had helped Alexander's father, Philip, build the original Macedonian military machine. He was the steady hand who commanded the critical left wing of the army at the massive empire-deciding battle of Gaugamela. At the time of his son's torture and execution, Parmenion was stationed hundreds of miles away in Ecbatana, guarding the army's vital supply lines and the massive treasury.
Alexander knew the political and military calculus. He knew that when Parmenion found out his son had been tortured and killed on flimsy evidence, the old, highly respected general might rebel. He had the troops and the money to split the empire.
So what did Alexander do?
Alexander didn't wait to see what Parmenion would do. He didn't send an envoy to explain. He sent assassins riding on the fastest horses across the desert to reach Parmenion before the news of his son's death did. They walked into the old general's tent, handed him a forged letter to distract him, and murdered a 70-year-old loyal veteran preemptively.
It's pure cold-blooded mafia tactics. And then there's the intellectual purge, which brings us to Callisthenes. Callisthenes was Aristotle's own nephew, and he was brought along on the campaign specifically to be the expedition's official historian. His literal job, mandated by Alexander, was to write the myth of the king's greatness for future generations to read.
But Callisthenes ran afoul of Alexander over the issue of proskynesis.
Proskynesis was the Persian court ritual of bowing sometimes completely to the floor before the king. To the Persians, it was a normal social acknowledgement of hierarchy. But to the Greeks and Macedonians, it was deeply offensive. In their culture, you only prostrated yourself before the gods. To do it for a mortal man was hubris, a massive offense to the divine order.
And Callisthenes, acting as a philosopher, argued logically and publicly against Alexander's demand for this ritual. He stated that Alexander was indeed a great man, the greatest of kings, but he was still a human being, not a god, and should not demand the honors of a god.
And for that,
For that intellectual resistance, for simply stating a theological fact of their shared culture, he was implicated in a conspiracy, imprisoned, dragged along with the army in a cage, and eventually died in captivity.
this raises an important question, one the source poses brilliantly. If the very man hired to write the myth of your greatness, the nephew of your own revered tutor, is tortured and executed simply for reminding you of your humanity, what hope does an anonymous captive woman in a conquered city have?
Exactly none.
If Alexander's empathy and restraint could not extend to his battlefield savior, his most loyal senior general, or his own historian, it certainly was never going to extend to the women of Thebes, Tyre, or Persepolis.
The empathy simply wasn't there. And that utter lack of empathy, combined with his staggering ego, is laid completely bare in what is arguably the most disastrous, self-inflicted catastrophe of the entire campaign, the crossing of the Gedrosian Desert.
Set the scene. It's 325 BC. The army has been marching, fighting and bleeding for 8 continuous years. They have pushed all the way to the Hyphasis River, deep into India. They are facing monsoon rains, strange diseases, and rumors of massive Indian armies with thousands of war elephants waiting for them across the river.
They're exhausted.
And finally, the men break. They mutiny. They simply refuse to march one step further east. They tell their king they want to go home.
Alexander is absolutely furious. He considers it a personal betrayal. He sulks in his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, hoping the men will feel guilty and relent. But they hold firm. He eventually realizes he has to give the order to turn back.
But he doesn't make it easy.
However, instead of taking the established, relatively safe, well-watered supply routes back toward Persia and Babylon, Alexander chooses the most dangerous, inhospitable route possible, the Gedrosian Desert, which runs along the modern Makran coast of Pakistan and Iran.
Why? I kept asking myself, why march an exhausted, mutinous army into a wasteland? The source makes it clear, because of pure ego. Alexander had heard the ancient legends that Cyrus the Great of Persia and the mythical Assyrian queen Semiramis had both tried to cross this specific desert and had lost nearly their entire armies in the sand.
So he saw it as a challenge.
Alexander, stung by the mutiny, wanted to prove he could survive where the greatest figures of the past had failed. He was willing to risk the lives of tens of thousands of people for a geographical flex to prove his superiority over ghosts.
And we have to deeply understand who he was risking. When we picture an ancient army on the march, we usually just picture a neat column of soldiers with spears. But that's entirely inaccurate. An ancient army was essentially a massive mobile city. The baggage train that followed the fighting men was enormous, often outnumbering the soldiers themselves.
So it was a whole community.
It was filled with merchants selling goods, craftsmen repairing armor camp followers, and crucially women. There were wives in Macedonia who had followed their husbands, local women legally acquired or married along the route, and thousands of enslaved women who were forced to do the cooking, the cleaning, the mending, and who bore the children of the soldiers.
These women formed the massive domestic and economic backbone of this mobile community. They kept the army functioning, but they had absolutely no say in the command decisions. When Alexander made the call to march into a blazing desert to stroke his own ego, the generals followed him. The soldiers followed the generals, and the women at the very back of the line had no choice but to follow the soldiers into hell. They couldn't desert, they had nowhere to go.
The crossing took 60 agonizing days, and the suffering was immediate and catastrophic. The heat was far beyond what the human body can tolerate for extended periods. The water sources marked on their rudimentary maps were either entirely dry or buried under shifting dunes.
The animals went first, right?
The baggage animals, the horses, the mules, the camels carrying the lifeblood of the army began to collapse and die first. And when the animals died, the supplies they carried had to be abandoned. Food, medicine, tents, spare clothing, all left in the sand.
And then the source describes a cruel twist of nature. While marching through a dry riverbed, a sudden, violent nighttime flash flood swept down from the distant mountains. It crashed into the camp while they were sleeping. Countless people, animals, and the last of the essential equipment were simply washed away in the dark.
It was an apocalyptic environment. But what the source emphasizes most heavily is the brutal hierarchy of survival that took over in the aftermath.
In an environment of extreme life-threatening scarcity, the social hierarchy dictates who lives and who dies. When they managed to find a muddy puddle or a small spring, the soldiers drank first. They were the military assets they needed to be kept alive to fight. The officers drank next.
And the women?
The camp followers, the children and the enslaved women at the rear of the long column, received absolutely nothing. They were pushed aside.
The descriptions from the ancient sources, even filtered as they are haunting. They describe women falling in the blistering sand, carrying dead or dying children, refusing to let go of the bodies until they themselves collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. And the absolute rule of the march was that the column could not stop. To stop in the desert was to die.
You just had to keep walking.
If a woman fell, if she couldn't get back up on her own, no one helped her. She was simply left behind, watching the army slowly disappear over the horizon, to die alone in the jagged salt flats.
Plutarch famously estimated that Alexander lost 3/4 of his entire army in the Gedrosian desert. Now, modern historians generally think that specific fraction is exaggerated, but they all agree the casualties were massive, easily in the tens of thousands. But the most revealing part of that statistic, as the source points out, is what it entirely leaves out.
Who it leaves out?
The ancient historians tried to estimate the military losses because soldiers were assets on a ledger. A dead soldier meant a decrease in Alexander's fighting capacity. It mattered to the state.
But the women in the baggage train who died of thirst, who were washed away in the flood, who were abandoned in the sand, they were never counted. There is no estimate of their deaths in any ancient text. Their deaths were literally unrecorded because, in the eyes of the historians and the military command, they were never considered worth counting to begin with. Their lives held no political or military ledger value.
It perfectly encapsulates the overarching theme of this entire deep dive. The valuation of human life in Alexander's empire was based entirely ruthlessly on utility to the conqueror. Which brings us to a fascinating, highly publicized contrast. We spent all this time detailing the brutal commodification, the enslavement, and the destruction of women. But there is one very famous story in the Alexander mythos that seems on the surface to contradict everything we've just discussed.
The story of Darius's family.
So what does this all mean when we look at the capture of the royal family of the Persian king Darius III? This is a very famous episode. It happened after the Battle of Aetius in 333 BC. Darius was defeated, panicked, and fled the battlefield in his chariot, leaving behind his entire royal camp. And in that camp were his mother, Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his daughters.
The traditional PR story that has been handed down through the centuries is that Alexander treated these captive royal women with immense, unprecedented respect and chivalry.
The ancient sources absolutely gush over this episode. They use it as the prime example of his virtue. Alexander doesn't enslave them. He houses them in royal pavilions with comfort befitting their status. He allows them to keep their servants and their titles. He famously addresses Darius's mother, Sisygambis' mother, and treats her with the deference of a son.
And when Darius's wife tragically dies in childbirth later on during the campaign, Alexander pauses to give her a magnificent, highly public funeral. It is framed by Plutarch and others the ultimate proof of his civilized character, proving he wasn't a barbarian conqueror, but a noble king.
But our source asks us once again to pull back the lens and look at the wider picture of what was happening that exact same day. At the exact same time, Alexander is politely bowing to the Persian queen mother in her silken tent. His soldiers are busy dragging thousands of ordinary Persian women from the surrounding city of Aetius into holding pens to be sorted, priced, and sold into the Mediterranean slave markets.
This is where we must draw a hard line between moral character and political calculation. Treating the royal family well was not an act of sudden moral awakening or genuine empathy. It was cold, hard, strategic calculation. Darius was still alive, he was still a massive threat, and he was actively trying to raise another army in the east.
So they were leverage.
His mother, wife, and daughters were the ultimate bargaining chips. They were immense political leverage.
Exactly. If Alexander had treated Sisygambis or Statera the way he treated the women of Thebes or Tyre, if he had allowed them to be assaulted or sold, it would have instantly ruined their value as hostages. It would have enraged the entire Persian Empire, unified the disparate satraps against him, and made a negotiated surrender with Darius impossible.
So the royal women were preserved in comfort entirely because they possessed high political value. The common women of Aetius possessed only commercial market value, so they were processed as cargo. The system sorted human beings strictly by their utility to the man in charge.
And we see the ultimate culmination of this calculated, cynical use of high-status women a few years later toward the end of his life in 324 BC. This brings us to the famous mass weddings at Susa. Alexander decides to organize an unprecedented massive spectacle. He orders 80 of his highest-ranking Macedonian and Greek officers to forcibly marry Persian and Median noblewomen in a massive simultaneous ceremony.
And he joins in too.
Alexander himself takes the lead, marrying Statera, the daughter of the king he defeated, along with another royal woman named Parasidas.
Historians have swooned over this event for centuries. If you read older textbooks, they call it a beautiful vision of cultural fusion, a symbolic merging of East and West. They frame it as the ultimate proof of Alexander's grand philosophical vision for a united, harmonious world empire, where the conquerors and the conquered become one family.
Again, this source demands that we look at it from the bride's perspective. Think about the psychological reality of that ceremony. These Persian noblewomen are standing at an altar forced by royal decree to participate in a ritual where they are being legally and physically bound to the exact men who slaughtered their fathers, their brothers, and their husbands.
They are marrying the commanders who burned their cities, looted their palaces, and destroyed their civilization. It wasn't cultural fusion. It was an act of absolute final possession, dressed up in ritual music and ceremony. It was a way to legitimize the Macedonian hold on Persian territory by inserting themselves into the Persian bloodlines.
And the ultimate proof that it was nothing but political theater, a cynical play for stability, came just 13 months later. In June of 323 BC, Alexander the Great dies suddenly in Babylon. He's just 32 years old, succumbing to a sudden fever after days of heavy drinking. And within months of his final breath, that supposedly grand vision of unity evaporates into thin air. Nearly every single Macedonian officer, with the notable exception of Seleucus, instantly divorces and abandons his Persian wife.
The political leverage those women represented vanished the exact moment Alexander stopped breathing. The officers no longer needed to pretend to care about Persian integration, so the women were instantly discarded. They were left behind in a rapidly fracturing empire, stripped of their original families by the wars, stripped of their status by the conquest, and eventually discarded by their foreign husbands.
The aftermath of Alexander's death is a story of immediate bloody chaos. The empire he built with so much violence didn't unite the world, it shattered it. His generals, men we've mentioned, like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus, immediately turned on each other. They carved up the vast territory he had conquered, like, as the source vividly puts it, men dividing meat. This sparked the wars of the Diadochi, 40 years of relentless, brutal successor wars that tore the ancient world apart.
And while those generals fought massive battles over the borders of the map, the lingering devastation of Alexander's campaigns remained deeply etched into the earth and into the populations he conquered. Thebes, once the glory of Greece, remained a ruined, broken shell of a city for decades. Tyre survived, but only as a vastly diminished version of its former glory, its proud island status permanently erased by the causeway that slowly silted up and permanently connected it to the mainland.
Persepolis, the jewel of the Persian Empire, was never rebuilt. Its blackened stone columns stood as silent monuments to a drunken whim and a broken contract. But the source insists that the most enduring devastation wasn't architectural. It was generational. The 30,000 women taken from Thebes, the 30,000 taken from Tyre, the uncounted thousands from Persepolis, Issus, and 100 other cities, they didn't magically go free when Alexander died in Babylon. The fall of the conqueror does not mean the liberation of the conquered.
No, they certainly did not go free. Slavery in the ancient world was a deeply entrenched foundational economic institution. The men who owned these women may have mourned the passing of the great conqueror, but their property ledgers remained unchanged. Those women lived out the rest of their lives in forced labor far from their homes. And crucially, any children they bore, whether to their masters or to other enslaved people, were born into that exact same condition. The trauma, the economic extraction, and the cultural erasure didn't end with the conquest. It compounded generation after generation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we have to ask the vital question. Why does this matter to you, the listener, today? Why spend an hour deconstructing a man who has been dead for 2,300 years? Does it really matter if we call him the Great or not?
It matters deeply because the way we are taught history directly shapes our modern psychological tolerance for how leaders, governments, and empires operate right now. If we are conditioned from childhood to focus solely on the hand holding the sword, to admire the strategy, the relentless ambition, the resulting greatness, while completely ignoring the body that sword opens, we develop a massive, dangerous blind spot.
We accept the unacceptable.
When we accept greatness as a valid historical excuse for mass atrocity, when we accept the passive voice without questioning it, we become complicit in erasing the victims. We learn to value the color of the map over the lives of the people living on it.
That is a powerful, sobering realization. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've talked extensively during this deep dive about how the ancient historians crafted this bulletproof narrative of greatness by actively silencing the victims and controlling the public relations of their era. But think about the ripple effect of that historical silence through time. Think about how many modern empires, how many political dictators, or even modern corporate titans have consciously modeled themselves after Alexander the Great. They read these ancient PR playbooks, they see how history forgives the ruthless if they are successful, and they use that exact blueprint to justify their own actions, framing the destruction of communities' livelihoods or competitors as necessary collateral damage in their pursuit of building their own empires. If Alexander is the unquestioned blueprint for greatness, perhaps it's time we investigate who else in our modern world is currently hiding their destructive actions behind their own carefully constructed curtain of thieves. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.